Chapter 5: Navigating the Global Environment. The learning objectives for this chapter include the nature of international business, and that has to do with what international business means, the recent trends in international business, management of globalization, as well as competition of organizations in a global market. Also, we'll be looking at the structure of the global economy, including learning about the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, as well as the World Trade Organization. Also be looking at the environmental challenges that are inherent in organizations while they are managing their businesses from an international perspective, and also the basic issues that are involved in competing in a global economy, including elements of organization size and the challenges with management of organizations in a global economy. The meaning of international business. Before we delve into what international business means, we want to look at what domestic business means. And domestic business basically refers to organizations that acquire all their resources and sell all their products or services within a single country. And such domestic businesses may include the local hair salon or the local restaurants that you find around the counties within a country. Now, looking at what an international business means, this would be a business that most likely is based in one country, which would be referred to as the parent or the home country, but acquires meaningful share of its resources and revenues from other countries. And some examples of organizations that fall under organizations that are international businesses include Walmart, the Lowe's, and Starbucks. International business basically is a pervasive process that touches virtually every sector of the economy and every business in the world. People around the world consistently use products that are imported from countries thousands of miles away. Further on the meaning of international business, we'll be looking at a multinational business. Now, multinational businesses would be organizations that have a worldwide marketplace from which they buy their raw materials, from which they obtain financial resources, and from which where or whereby or geographical locations where they manufacture their products and to which they sell their products subsequently. And an example of organizations that fall under the multinational businesses would be Coca-Cola and the Ford Vehicle Company. Now, looking at a global business, this would be organizations that transcend national boundaries and are not committed to a single home country. Like we said earlier on for the international business, as much as organizations that are international businesses are residents in a parent country or home country, they obtain their shares from other countries. But for a global business, there is no particular country that is considered their home country or their parent country. And some examples of the global business will be organizations that are into the social media business like Facebook, X, or Google, or organizations that are into the media such as CNN, BBC, and Al Jazeera. The diagram on this slide illustrates the levels of international activity by organizations, and it basically depicts a spectrum of the levels of international activity, how the organizations progressively go through internationalization, meaning that from organizations who basically obtain their raw materials and supply their goods to customers locally, which are domestic businesses or organizations that operate as domestic businesses, they transcend into international activity by starting off as international businesses. Then they could grow into being multinational businesses by being present in several countries rather than just exporting their goods and services to those countries. They probably would have a subsidiary or presence, maybe by strategic alliance in those countries. And also another way for international activity, an increased form of international activity by organizations, would be to progress into being global businesses. Trends in international business. The United States of America dominated the global market after the Second World War because most organizations in these war-torn countries did not have the financial or sufficient financial resources to go into manufacturing of goods or to go into delivering services. Now you find out that the rebuilt countries most times or in the most part were poised for growth, while US companies, because of their dominance in the global market over time, they became complacent. And also increased population and affluence amongst the US consumers or US customers meant that the US populace or the US customers wanted new and better products, whereas the US organizations that had become complacent weren't proactive or weren't geared towards ensuring that the customers or whatever forms of goods or whatever specification of goods the customers wanted were provided. Thus, given this complacence from organizations in the United States, foreign products from these rebuilt countries that were devastated ab initio from the Second World War, foreign products from these organizations that have been rebuilt now started flooding the US market. Thus, the competition that came in domestically into the US environment. Managing the process of globalization. Organizations, especially organizations that delve into international business or the international business environment, have several strategies for which they actually compete on the global market stage. And one of such strategies would be exporting. Exporting has to do with making a product or an organization's product in their domestic marketplace and selling it in another country. We have the importing, which is the bringing in of goods, service, or capital into the home country of an organization from outside the country or from abroad. And the advantages for these strategies towards globalization of organizations would be that it's easier for organizations to enter the market with a small outlay of capital if they are exporting their products or services, and they don't need to adapt their product or services to the specifications of the local customers of the country where they are exporting these goods. So their products are basically exported or transported to these countries where they have customers the way they are sold even in the domestic market. These goods or services aren't customized to suit the preferences of customers in the new geographical location. Now, the disadvantages of this strategy towards globalization would be that such exports or imports are subject to taxes, tariffs, and higher transportation expenses. Now, when you talk about tariffs, you can understand that businesses that are adopting this form of globalization or internationalization or competition in the international markets would be greatly impacted in this political era whereby the Trump administration is actually increasing the tariffs for products that are imported into the United States. So these companies that export their goods into the United States, that have international customers that are resident in the United States, would be impacted greatly by this tariff. So you see that this is one of the disadvantages of this strategy towards internationalization or globalization, as you may want to call it. Further on managing the process of globalization. Another strategy organizations adopt towards globalization is licensing, and this is an arrangement whereby one company allows another organization to use its brand name rather, trademark, technology, patent, copyright, or other assets in exchange for a royalty based on the sales that are made by this organization that is using their brand name. And the advantages for this strategy towards globalization is that profitability and extended profitability is the case, whereby organizations can be more profitable without having to, one, enter into the foreign markets themselves, two, having to be the ones to actually market the products and the services. Now, these organizations basically have to generate revenue by selling their brand name or selling their franchises or their trademarks or their technology. Now, the disadvantages for this form of globalization by organization is the inflexibility that is associated with it. And licensees, which is the organizations that are granted the latitude of freedom to use another organization's brand name and trademark or technology and patent, these licensees can take advantage of the knowledge and skill available to them and exploit them in the organization's home market, whereby they can now become producers of those goods and services in their own market or in their own country, thereby sapping or taking the businesses away from organizations that are actually internationalizing by licensing. Now, we'll also be looking at the strategic alliance form of globalization, whereby this is a cooperative arrangement between two or more firms for mutual gain. And an example of such arrangements would be seen among airlines, the Disney movies, and food producers. So another such arrangement will be the arrangement between the Uber and Spotify, whereby Uber riders can stream music from Spotify playlists whenever they take a ride. Finally, on managing the process of globalization, we have the joint venture, where this is an arrangement where a strategic alliance is formed, and the partners in this alliance share in the ownership of an operation on an equity basis. The advantage of such form of globalization is that it avails organizations quick entry into a market through the utilization of existing strength of another organization that is resident in that geographical location. It avails these organizations to access to technology or raw materials, and it allows for risks and cost of the new venture to be shared by the partnering organizations. The disadvantages of such an arrangement towards globalization is the shared ownership and limited control, because given that there is some form of partnership, it means that for decisions to be made, it would require the consent of the partners in the joint venture. Now we'll be looking at direct investment, and this is an arrangement when a firm is headquartered in one country but builds and purchases operating facilities, or what you call subsidiaries, in another country, or what you call a foreign country. And this is most times called the foreign direct investment, as the case may be. We see several examples of those whereby organizations have subsidiaries in other countries. An example would be, for instance, the telecommunication companies that are in the United States, for instance, like the AT&T. You can see them also resident in other countries of the world, as the case may be. Now you have the maquiladoras, and this form of globalization is such whereby there is an assembly plant in northern Mexico that allows for tax break by the Mexican government. And these maquiladoras, these plants are actually close to the US border, and a large population of workers are willing to work in these plants for low wages. And it definitely delivers its goods and services duty free, tariff free, and the products are exported as well. Competing in a global market. When organizations internationalize or get into the global market, the complexity of these organizations increase due to the fact that they're now operating in diverse environments. So there is less degree of homogeneity within these organizations, given their diverse environment of operations. That increases the complexity. And you find out that in the global market, most times, once organizations internationalize, they get into competition even with the domestic firms or the domestic organizations. So they get into competition with these multinational organizations whose strategy is basically to compete aggressively on the global market stage. Also, complexities, like we also say, are greater for managers that are working in these internationalized firms or global firms. The table contained in this slide enumerates the advantages and disadvantages of the different strategies organizations adopt towards internationalization or globalization. So you can read through the different advantages and disadvantages as contained on this table. Mature market economies and systems. Market economy is an economy based on the private ownership of businesses, and that allows for market factors such as supply and demand to determine the business strategy within these economies. And countries that would fall under the market economy or that operate this market economy would include the United States, Canada, Japan, United Kingdom, France, Germany, and Sweden. And these countries basically rely on market forces for the allocation of resources. And you find out that in most cases, most organizations in this country that avail goods and services to the customers or the citizens of this country are basically owned by private businesses rather than public institutions of the government. The map on this slide basically highlights the mature market systems, the high potential growth economies, as well as the emerging economies in the world. The map contained on this slide basically illustrates the mature market systems, the high potential growth economies, as well as the emerging economies around the world. Further on mature market economies and systems. Market systems are clusters of countries that engage in high levels of trade with one another. One of such market systems are or is rather the North American Free Trade Agreement, and this is an agreement that was made by the United States, Canada, and Mexico in 1993 for trade to be promoted among these countries. Also, you have the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, which was signed in 2018 and in the process of replacing the North American Free Trade Agreement. However, as we can see, businesses that are from these countries that are part of this agreement who are into exporting of their goods and services would face the new dispensation or the new tariff regimes that are being implemented by this new Trump administration. So you find out that it goes to show that the tariff may take or may take precedence over these agreements, in which that in such situations these agreements may not hold water any longer. And it goes to show how much the political dimension of the general environment of the external environment of organizations, right? How the political dimension of the general perspective of the external environment of organizations, how it can impact the organization's businesses, whereby businesses or organizations that are into exporting of their goods and services into the United States will be greatly impacted by the political decisions made by this Trump administration. Another example of the market systems that are mature would be the European Union. And actually, it was the first market system that ever existed, or an international market system that ever existed, and it comprises 27 member nations, and 11 countries eliminated their home currencies and adopted a common currency called the euro based off this agreement, or based off this market system called the European Union. The euro was developed, and some countries now have adopted them as their basic currency. 8 others have since done the same. Not all countries are equally developed in this European Union, which has slowed down and complicated the trade relationship between the constituent countries. Another mature market economy or system would be the Pacific Asia. This is a market system located in South Asia. China, which country is China, a country that is part of this Pacific Asia market system, is currently the second largest economy in the world. High potential, high growth economies. These are found in countries whose economies are just beginning to emerge as important business centers, or what you may call the emerging markets. Now, the high potential, high growth refers to countries that were underdeveloped and were immature. Now, these underdeveloped and immature economies basically are characterized by weak industries, weak currency, and relatively poor consumers rather. And examples of countries that fall under these high potential, high growth economies would be China, India, Brazil, Russia, or what you can call the BRICS. Also, other countries include the Vietnam, and South Africa would be the S in the BRICS acronym. India is also emerging as a major force in the global economy, right behind China, that is the second largest economy, currently experiencing strong development and growth. What are the barriers to international growth, international trade rather? Consumers' lack of wealth and poor infrastructural development constitute barriers to international trade. Other economies. These refer to developing economies that have a mixed model for resource allocation because of the level of uncertainty in such environments. Now, these countries hold tremendous wealth, but the political instability that is extant in the environment and the cultural differences all combine to make doing business very risky and difficult in these locations. Example of such systems will be the Middle East, and this Middle East defies classification. The Middle East comprises countries that hold tremendous wealth but are politically unstable and exhibit vast cultural differences. Such countries are involved in political or ethnic violence, and they constitute business risks. Cuba as a country offers unique opportunity because it is getting into the global stage and is offering a lot of competitive values on the global stage. Developing economies as well have great potential but require large investment in their distribution systems, and they run the risk of major policy changes that can distort the value of investments. The role of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization. General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This agreement was negotiated in an effort to avoid trade wars and is intended to promote international trade by reducing trade barriers. It served as a major stimulus to international trade after its ratification in 1948 by 23 countries. Also, the principles of this agreement are guided by what you call the most favored nation principle. And the most favored nation principle is such that when a favor or a preferential treatment is extended to a participating country in the agreement, such preferential treatment is extended to all countries that are participants of the agreement as well, or signatories to the agreement as well. Further on the role of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade and the World Trade Organization. World Trade Organization, this as at February 2024 included 166 member nations. It used to be 164 member nations as at 2016, but as at 2024, that number increased to 166. And it requires member nations to open their markets to international trade and follow the World Trade Organization rules. The rules include to promote trade flow by encouraging nations to adopt non-discriminatory and predictable trade policies. It also includes to reduce remaining trade barriers through unilateral negotiations among nations that are transacting businesses. And also includes, the rules also include to establish impartial procedures for resolving trade disputes. Environmental challenges of international management. As, as reflected on the diagram on this slide, we can see that most of the challenges that are faced in international management come from the general environmental perspective of the external environment of organizations. And if we recall that acronym PESTEL, PESTEL will include for P being the political, E being the economic, S being the socio-cultural, T being the technological, another E being the environmental, and L being the legal. And you can see contained on this diagram the economic environment posing a challenge to international management because of the diverse economic systems that exist between the parent country and the host country. Also, the natural resources that may be resident in the host country that is basis for the internationalization of an organization. That also speaks to the economic environment of that geographical location. And also the infrastructural development also in the location or the foreign location of an organization's business operation would also impact what the economy is like, given the distribution of goods and services easily. So where there is poor infrastructural development, there is increase in the prices of distribution of goods and services, which ultimately impact the prices of goods and services that are sold to customers. Now, the political or legal environment, as captured here, you find out that the political or government stability, the nature of stability of the government of the host location or the host country, impacts the management of organizations in these locations, right? And also the incentives for international trade, the controls on international trade, be it the tariffs that are put in place. For example, with this new political dispensation in the United States, there are increases in tariffs which are actually impacting the international management of organizations that are exporting their goods and services into the United States. That's why it's called controls on international trade, which one would include the tariffs or taxes. Now, economic communities also would be such that they have a legal or political implication towards international management. Now, the cultural environment, which is captured under the S in PESTEL, socio-cultural, right, is indicative of what the values or symbols or beliefs and language is like in the new host location of an organization where they operate, right? That is different from the language, the symbols, the values that are existent in the organization's home country or parent country. You find out that that poses a challenge in the management of such organizations in that new location. Also, the individual behaviors of customers or members of the community in the environment of the organization's operation in a foreign country. Also, the individual behaviors across culture, the differences in culture that impact behaviors of individuals in these divergent environments impacts or influences the management of these organizations. The economic environment. There are three aspects of the economic environment. The first being the economic system, and this refers to the freedom of choice of consumers and organizations to be in the market. And this freedom of choice is what influences the demand and supply of goods and services in the market, because on the demand side is it relates to how much need consumers have for the goods and services that are provided by organizations, and the supply dimension is how much capacity does the organizations have in fulfillment of the needs of the consumers or the customers in that environment. Also, another aspect of the economic environment will be the nature of property ownership. And there are two categories of this. One, you have the private ownership, which is by individuals and organizations where they own and operate companies that conduct business in a country. But when you have public ownership of property, that will be the government of that country owning the companies or the institutions that provide goods and services to their populace or to their citizens. Another aspect of the economic environment will be natural resources. And the natural resources that are domiciled in countries, they vary from country to country. Some countries are more endowed with natural resources than others, and that is why most times you find organizations also internationalizing or establishing businesses in countries whereby there are lots of natural resources, especially natural resources that are relevant to the business of these organizations. And also, with regards to natural resources, the access to these resources and use of these resources will differ from country to country, given what laws or given the environment. Further on the economic environment, infrastructure. Infrastructure would refer to availability of schools, hospitals, power plants, railroads, and the likes like that, such as highways, ports, airfields, and distribution systems. These all make up infrastructure, and they are relevant towards the management of organizations, especially organizations that are multinational businesses that are resident in the host country as a subsidiary, right? Because these organizations, in the delivery of their goods and services to customers, they are required to actually sometimes improve on the infrastructure in their environment. So, development of infrastructure most times in a country affects the operations of businesses or how much businesses generate in revenue, because countries that have well developed infrastructure pose less challenge for managers, especially managers in international businesses, right? But where the country has poorly developed infrastructure, then these managers have to navigate through how to deliver their goods and services both efficiently and effectively in the face of poor infrastructure. The political legal environment of a foreign country location has to do with the government stability in that country, and it includes the ability of people to stay in power or the permanence of policies towards businesses, because when there's more permanence in the leadership or people in government, then policies are less likely to change. So when there's some form of stability or political stability in the foreign country location, then in most cases, more often than not, the policies that affect businesses are pretty much consistent and not changing given the changes in political dispensations. And if nationalized, the company is taken over by the government, you'll find out that this was evident in the event of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, when the Western world or Western countries imposed sanctions on Russia, impacting their organizations that are doing business in Russia. Most of those businesses were asked to either continue doing business as they would have before sanctions were were imposed on Russia, or forfeit their businesses to the Russian government. So you find out that instability in the political environment of a country can actually warrant for organizations to be nationalized or being taken over by the government of that country. Also, we'll be looking at incentives for multinational trade in relation to the political legal environment of a foreign country location of an organization's business. And the incentives for multinational trade would include what are the tax cuts that are made available to these organizations, or what are the interest rates, are they low to encourage these organizations to actually access financial resources from these foreign country locations in order to actually improve their businesses, and what are the other subsidies that are availed to these multinational businesses or international businesses to actually encourage their growth in these foreign country locations. Further on the political legal environment, we'll be looking at the controls on international trade or control on international businesses of organizations. The first will be tariff. A tariff is a tax collected on the goods shipped across national boundaries. And the next will be the quota, which is a limit on the number or value of goods that can be traded in a foreign country by a business that is resident in another country. An export restraint agreement between governments sets voluntary limits on goods exported or imported from each other. Also, there's this legislation called the binational legislation, which ensures for preference or ensures for businesses to be given more to domestic producers, whereby even in the face of aggressive competition by multinational businesses, domestic businesses are able to thrive given the binational legislation, which allows or avails these domestic businesses to sell their goods more to the citizens of a country rather than the multinational businesses selling their own goods or services. Finally, on the political legal environment, we have the economic community, which is a group of countries that agree to significantly reduce or eliminate trade barriers among the participating nations. And this is a formalized market system. Example of such economic community will be the European Union or the USMCA, the United States Mexico Canada Agreement, the Latin American Integration Association, the Caribbean Common Market, and even in West Africa where you have the economic community of West African states. These economic communities basically allow for very, very reduced trade barriers or even totally eliminated trade barriers between the participating countries or the constituent countries. The cultural environment, which is an element of the socio-cultural environment denoted by the S in the acronym PESTEL. The cultural environment includes the values, symbols, beliefs, and language differences that exist between the parent country of an organization and the host country of an organization. And different cultures value time differently, right? So you find out that the the value for time by the Americans actually differ from the value for time by the Chinese. Americans always are conscious of their time. So, for instance, if you give an American an appointment for 10 a.m., the American will definitely be there by 10 a.m. and expects you to be there by 10 a.m. because where you're not there by 10 a.m., the American most likely will leave the venue for the appointment shortly after 10 a.m. if you're not there. Now, the Chinese, if given an appointment for 10 a.m., will definitely be there by 10 a.m. But if you are not there by 10 a.m. and do not get there till maybe 5 p.m., trust me, when you get there by 5 p.m., the Chinese will still be there waiting on the appointment, which was scheduled for 10 a.m. So you find out that different cultures value their time differently, and language also can pose a barrier given the diverse culture of in the different environments of these organizations that operate internationally. Also, spoken words and non-verbal aspects of language can pose problems for managers, right? So you find out that there are spoken word differences and non-verbal aspect differences in the culture across nations or across these environments that international organizations or business organizations that are into international businesses operate. So such divergences in the meanings of spoken words and non-verbal languages could actually be problematic for international managers. Now you have the social orientation, which is a person's belief about the relative importance of the individual versus the group to which that person belongs, right? So you have two opposing beliefs based on the social orientation, and they include the individualism, which states that the person comes first, and the collectivism, which states that the group comes first. So it depends on what the social orientation is. That actually links to the cultural environment of organizations. The diagram contained in this slide enumerates the divergences in orientations given the differences across cultures. Globalization and organization size. Multinational corporations. These are organizations that adopt a global perspective and compete in the global marketplace. These organizations usually transfer capital, technology, sometimes human resources, and inventory and information from the parent country or home country to the host country or foreign country location. Medium-sized organizations. These organizations remain primarily domestic but may buy and sell products made abroad and may face foreign competition in their own domestic market as well. And given the competition that they face in their domestic market, you find out that these medium-sized organizations increasingly go international and expand into foreign markets in order to improve their competitiveness and sell to more customers because of the ongoing competition in their domestic market. Small organizations, these are organizations that participate as local suppliers to MCCs, and some perform simple importing and exporting. Now, these small organizations benefit from a global economy by being able to sell their products and services to a much larger organization or to a much larger customer base without having to change many, if any, of their current work procedures. Management challenges in a global economy. Planning and decision making. The managers in an international business need a broad understanding of the environments they operate in and competition that exists in those environments in order to plan. The critical issues that exist in such environments need to be addressed. Knowledge orientation of the top managers in such organizations impact the organizational strategy and decision making, and the amount of information required to make sound business decisions also is greater in a global economy. Organizing. The degree of control availed to local managers in an international business determines how much ability these local managers have towards addressing the difficulties that arise in the environment. And managers, most often than not, organizations most often than not, have to address issues relating to the organization structure and design, how the organization manages change, and also how they deal with the human resources. So if little control is provided to managers in an international business, then most often than not, or in a subsidiary of a globalized business, most often than not, these managers would have to travel or communicate with the corporate headquarters in order to make decisions. Whereas managers with more control can simply reorganize the business in a way that they think it should be done, highlighting the gaps or effects of a corporate structure. The corporate structure, what kind of structure exists in the organization, determines whether much authority or control is availed to managers at the subsidiary level, or whether those authority or degree of control is only concentrated at the corporate level at the headquarters. Management challenges in a global economy. The leading functions. For managers to lead effectively in a global economy, they have to understand how cultural factors affect individuals, how motivational processes vary across cultures, how the role of leadership changes in different cultures, and how communication varies across cultures, as well as how interpersonal and group processes depend on cultural background. The controlling function of managers. The basic issues associated with controlling function for managers in an international business revolve around operations management, productivity, quality, technology, and the information systems that are available for decision making or that are utilized for control measures.